We're going to go back to the teachings on the Amitabha practice, and I'm going to go specifically here to talk more from the Chinese perspective of the practice, so that you can get an idea of how it's viewed in that tradition. And here's some of the quotations from the great Pure Land practitioners in the Chinese tradition. They often spoke from the view of the Chittamatra, sometimes the Madhyamaka, sometimes the Tathagata view. And but what I'm realizing in selecting certain citations that are in here is that you can read one citation from one view and you can read it from another view, and the words in the citation are the same. Okay, so clearly with my Madhyamaka background, that's the view I'm going to be reading things from. But you might also see that there's some flavor from what Jeffrey has been teaching us, because, I think the Nyingma view was influenced quite a bit by the Tathagarba. I can never say it with the accent on the right syllable. Tathagarba. Yeah, on that view. Okay. And it's interesting because the Nyingma tradition was mostly in eastern Tibet, and that's borders on China, which was where the Tathagatagarbha view became quite popular. It came from India, of course, but it became very popular in China and along that border region. Anyway, okay, so in the Chinese tradition, in one of the sutras, they speak about a monk named Dharmakara, and he generated bodhicitta while listening to the teachings from a Buddha named Lokeshvara Raja. And this Buddha then taught him about the qualities of the Pure Land, and the monk Dharmakara made a very strong resolution. What did we call? How did I turn? Unshakable resolve, not to attain full awakening until his Pure Land consisted of these best and wonderful qualities. And so he practiced very long and hard for many eons and attained awakening as Buddha Amitabha. So there's three main sutras that in the Chinese canon that speak of the Amitabha practice. The first one is called the Larger Amitabha Sutra, or the Larger Sutra on the Adornments of the Pure Land, and then also the Shorter Sutra on the Adornments of the Pure Land, also known as the Shorter Amitabha Sutra. So both of those are also translated into Tibetan. And then the third one that is in the Chinese canon is called the Sutra on the Meditation of Amitayus, also called the Meditation Sutra. Okay, so Amitabha is the Nirmanakaya form of the Buddha. Amitayus is the Sambhogakaya form. And that sutra doesn't seem to have a Tibetan translation. Okay, but the Pure Land practice is spoken of in many, many Mahayana sutras. So it's not just something, recently invented or something like that. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, from which the King of Prayers comes, it speaks about, the King of Prayers initially came from Sudana, this one young man who went to 53 bodhisattva teachers to learn about the path. And the King of Prayers was kind of taught to him by his final teacher, Samantabhadra. And of course, we know from reading that prayer very much. There's a verse that says, Those who make this heartfelt aspiration for the Bodhisattva way will be free of lower rebirths, free of harmful companions, and will quickly see Amitabha, Buddha of infinite light. Okay, so there it is, right there in the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's also mentioned in the Prajnaparamita Sutra and in the Surangama Sutra and the Lotus Sutra, which are all Mahayana sutras common to the Tibetan canon and the Chinese canon. The Nagarjuna was predicted as a bodhisattva, the first level bodhisattva who's born in the land of joy. And then it says that after he attained the first bhumi, which is called the joyful, and that after his life as Nagarjuna, he will be born in the land of peace and bliss, referring to Sukhavati, Amitabha's Pure Land. Vasubandhu also wrote on the Pure Land practice, as did Stiramati, his disciple. And, it went from India to China, and it started being practiced in China around the 2nd century. And then it became more and more popular as time went on. So there was a 5th and 6th century great master named Tan Luan, and his teacher was the Indian master Bodhiruchi, who we hear of, okay? And he used the recitation of the Dharani, or the mantra of Amitabha, to develop meditative concentration. And he was the one, Tan Luan, who advocated what is called Nianfo. Excuse my Chinese, how do you pronounce it correctly? Nianfo. Nianfo. Okay, someday I'll get it. How about Nianfo? Nianfo. Fo. Okay, so that practice, it means literally mindfulness or recollection of the Buddha. Yeah, which is a standard practice in both the Pali tradition and the Mahayana tradition, to recollect or remember or contemplate the qualities of the Buddha. And so when he used the term Nianfo, it referred to the Buddha Amitabha. And in his early writings, Tianlun's early writings, it referred to recollection of Amitabha with the mental consciousness and developing concentration on that. However, as over centuries, it came to mean the recitation of Amitabha's name. Okay, so you can see it started out one way, and over the centuries, the term came to have another meaning. And my guess is that because in ancient China, with the exception of the literati, most of the people were illiterate, and they needed a simple practice. There were a lot of wars, very dire circumstances, and they needed a simple practice that would give them a lot of faith and inspiration to keep good ethical conduct, to be kind and compassionate to other people. And so that's one reason why I think the meaning changed from a meditative recollection of Amitabha done with the mental consciousness to a recitation of Amitabha's name. Okay, so the term Nian, Fo means Buddha, Nian means recollect, so it actually has 3 meanings. So the first meaning is meditation or concentration, meaning meditation or concentration on Amitabha. Okay, the second meaning is the time of one thought, and the third meaning is verbal recitation. Okay, and there another Chinese term called Xi Nian. Xi means 10. Shi Nian. Okay, Uh, thank you. So that came to mean 10 recitations or 10 moments, which comes up later. Okay. Um, and so as time went on, Tianlun's practice uh, switched more from the mental contemplation of Amitabha to which involves more what they call self-power or self-reliance, which our tradition emphasizes quite a bit, that you have to improve yourself. And as His Holiness always tells us, it's not just by praying to the Buddha that we're going to get to awakening. But it started moving in China more towards other power, so that in addition to our own power, in other words, our practice and our own effort, it also came to mean that one could get realizations due to the merit and the qualities of Amitabha, because Amitabha made these kind of unshakable resolves, before he attained awakening. And if a bodhisattva makes unshakable resolves, there's some power and energy to that will influence us and enable us to gain realizations. Okay, and so we can see historically, it it went from kind of more self-power to other power, and especially in Japan, with the Jodo Shin tradition, it's like almost completely other power, and relying on Amitabha and faith in Amitabha and, Amitabha's unshakable resolves that will help us gain realizations. One other thing that Tan Luan did in his teachings is he included, and Amitabha did this too, people who had created great negative karma in the field of people who, through their earnest practice and Amitabha's, the blessings of Amitabha's unshakable resolves, could be born in the Pure Land. Although he did not go as far as to say people who deprecated the Dharma could be born in the Pure Land, because that's kind of the worst of the worst is, and it makes sense. I mean, if you deprecate the Dharma, you're not going to have any faith. You're not going to follow any of the instructions or advice. And so how are you going to create the causes to be born in the Pure Land? So there were many highly realized Pure Land masters in Chinese history, and a number of them also practiced Chan. And in the more recent history, Chan and Pure Land came to be merged in many ways, especially, I think, in the last century. And so that's why when you see Luminary Temple or Dharma Drum Temple, they call themselves Chan temples, but they also practice Pure Land practice. Yeah, and I think in Vietnam it's the same, and so the Chan and Pure Land have really come together in a very complementary way. Okay, so there's two levels of Pure Land practice. One's called the Transcendental Level and one's called the Ordinary Level. And this depends more on, it depends on the faculties and dispositions of the disciples. So again, we see here an example of how Buddha teaches different things to different people according to their faculties and their dispositions. Okay, and so those who recite the Buddha's name and practice in that way on an ordinary level, they believe that the Pure Land is an external place, and so they want to, by reciting the Buddha's name, be born in that place called the Pure Land. And they're probably the ones who think that Amitabha is going to come at the time of death and lead them to the Pure Land. He's going to appear and extend his hand, and you're going to grab it and follow him to the Pure Land. So that's for people on a more basic level who take things very literally, who don't have much inclination for the deeper meaning of the philosophical texts, okay? And so they do more the external practice, making offerings, reciting the Buddha's name, and so on. This is not putting down those people. It's saying that this is a practice that suits their faculties and dispositions, and by doing that will eventually lead them to become more interested in other levels of the Amitabha practice. So in the transcendental level, okay, then the people relate, let me go back to the ordinary level. There's a few more qualities there. So these people don't understand that the Pure Land is created by the mind and that the mind is the Buddha. Okay, and so they relate to Amitabha as somebody external to them, like a child does to their mother, calling out to their mother, or in this case to Amitabha, for compassion and protection. So that's the ordinary level of practice. Then the people doing the transcendental practice see that that Amitabha and the Pure Land as innate features of their own pure mind. In other words, they see that the Pure Land is created by the mind. And so they use the Buddha's name, which is innate in their own minds and is also the creation of the mind. So here we're getting into the Tathagata philosophy. They use those as focal points to help them remember this deeper truth. So here we can see, in our tradition, we often talk about to our ordinary minds, this appears as a very polluted world, but to somebody who has high realizations, they see this world as an entirely different way than we do. Okay? So what we're talking about, the Chinese tradition, has links in our own tradition and also has links in the Pali tradition with the story of when there was a famine and there was nothing to eat until the one man who took care of horses, he came along and he gave some horse fodder to the monks and to the Buddha. And the monks ate it and said, this stuff is disgusting. And they felt so terrible that the Buddha had to eat such disgusting food. But then the Buddha said, oh, it doesn't bother me at all. In fact, it tastes quite nice. And he took a bit of the fodder that he had chewed and given it to these ordinary monks who tasted it, and it tasted delicious. Okay, so here we see from the Pali Sutras into the Chinese sutras, into the Tibetan sutras, this same theme of the level of your mind determines how you experience things. So the level of your mind creates your reality. Okay, so the people practicing, doing the Amitabha practice on the transcendental level, this is how they view the practice. So Amitabha, the Pure Land is created by mind, and they use the Buddha's name, which is innate in their own mind. Okay, now I don't think that means that the Buddha's mind is like, or the Buddha's name is going round and around on your mind at an innate level. It has some other meaning that relates to our Buddha potential. Okay, and that, so the Buddha name, which is innate in their own minds, is also the creation of the mind, and that acts as a focal point to help them remember the deeper truth. Okay, so for these practitioners who aim for full awakening and see rebirth in Amitabha's Pure Land as a step towards full awakening, versus the more ordinary beings who see rebirth in Amitabha's land as a way of escaping from rebirth in the lower realms and in suffering places. So these transcendental practitioners For them, meditating on Amitabha and reciting his name transforms the ordinary afflictive mind into what is called the self-nature true mind. That is, it enables them to realize the Buddha nature, which in Chan and Pure Land is called the original face, or emptiness. Okay, so they're using this practice to realize the natural purity of the mind, okay, or natural nirvana, and by realizing this natural nirvana, what's called your original face, the emptiness of the mind, of even the afflictive mind, of all of our minds, by realizing that, then you're able to gain the nirvana of a Buddha. Okay, yeah, and uh, and the natural purity of your mind, together with the purity from adventitious stains, becomes the nature body of a fully awakened Buddha. Okay, so that's how those people are practicing. And so the wisdom that does that is called the original wisdom, and it knows that all phenomena arise dependently, and yet they have no self-nature. Okay, and so here's a quotation from Chun Hung, one of the Pure Land masters. So he says, mind is basically unborn. Sound familiar? Mind is basically unborn. It is born when causal conditions come together. Mind basically does not die. It dies when causal conditions disperse. There seem to be birth and death, but fundamentally there is no going or coming. If you can understand this, you will be at peace through birth and death, ever still, ever aware. Sounds like Nagarjuna, doesn't it? Okay. If you cannot yet understand this, then you must wholly abandon your personal existence and continuously recite the phrase Amitabha Buddha and seek birth in the Pure Land. So there he is. He's setting up the two levels of practice. The first for the transcendental people, but if you can't get that, then abandon your personal existence. Stop looking for your own happiness of this life. Stop thinking about yourself. Continuously recite the name of Amitabha and seek birth in the Pure Land. And certainly, continuously reciting the name of Amitabha, then you stop reciting the lyrics from the latest song, and you stop reciting rap music, and you stop reciting all that stuff, which has certain meanings and a certain energy to the rhythm of the music that affects your mind. Yeah, because our mind likes to listen to things, doesn't it? And so this is, instead of letting the mind listen to whatever is out there and be influenced that, we're steering the mind to listen to the name Amitabha, Amitabha Buddha, Amitabha Buddha, okay? Yeah, and so we're imprinting in the mind a totally different energy than if we leave our senses unrestrained, where, for example, our hearing sense just gets attracted to whatever nice melody happens to go by it and starts repeating whatever afflictive lyrics are in most of those songs. Okay, so you can really see, the reason for doing this. And this corresponds very much to, for example, in our tantric practice, how in the break time between sessions, you continue to recite the mantra. Yeah. So, we have instructions to see all phenomena as the Buddha and the Pure Land. to see all sound, to hear all sounds as the mantra, and to regard all your thoughts as the thoughts of a Buddha. So you see, it's the same kind of thing going on, I think, expressed in different words. Okay, so that's it for today. Let's see, how do I do this? Well, I don't. Okay, so I just have to remember where I was for tomorrow. Yes?
Sorry if you already mentioned this. There's a lot, but so does anyone in that system regard that practice as tantra, or use that term even?
Okay, now it's interesting, in the Chinese tradition, this is regarded as Sutrayana. Yeah, Tantra went into China, but it didn't spread widely. And so it's regarded as Sutrayana. In the Tibetan tradition, I've looked at some things that regards this as Sutrayana, and yet there's also a Jainang into the Amitabha practice. So it could be in the Tibetan tradition, it started out one way and went into Tantra, or who knows how it happened, how these things develop historically.
Is it possible to enter the Pure Land while you're still a human being, or do you have to die and be reborn in some other body?
Yeah, well, rebirth in the Pure Land regards leaving these afflictive aggregates and taking new aggregates in Sukhavati. Yeah, that's how it works in that particular Pure Land. I mean, it's not that these aggregates go to Sukhavati. Yeah.
I mean, like if you get realizations and your vision becomes more pure, could you then say that suddenly the world around you is the Pure Land?
It may appear that way to you, sure, but you haven't yet taken rebirth in Sukhavati. Yeah. Yeah.
Amitabha.
Well, with Amitabha on the head of Chenrezig and Tara, that's getting back to the 5 Dhyani Buddhas. Okay. And so the way that in the Tantric system, Buddhas are classified according to one family or another. But that could also relate, yeah, to when you talk about Amitabha's Pure Land. Amitabha is the chief Buddha, and he has 2 disciples, one of which is Chenrezig, and the other is Mahaprajna, whose name I can never pronounce, who somehow in the Tibetan tradition became known as Vajrapani. I don't know how, because how she's depicted in Chinese is quite different than in the Tibetan. Okay, so there's some link there. Historians talk about Tara and, how in China, Kuan Yin, Chenrezig was sometimes male, sometimes female. So some people say that the Tara practice originated in bringing making Kuan Yin into 2 deities, one being a male Chenrezig and one being a female Tara in the Tibetan tradition. That's how some religious historians may look at it. Of course, from the Tibetan viewpoint, well, they say Tara was born from a tear of Chenrezig, so, already connected to Amitabha in that way. But while you feel connection, like you mentioned, to Amitabha because of your connection to Tara and Chenrezig, it's very important to realize that all the Buddhas have the same realizations, okay? And that they appear in these different forms, again, according to sentient beings' dispositions and interests and so on. But from their side, the realizations are the same.